Welcome to the discussion series on free trade and liberalization as part of the 1991 project at the Mercatus Center. I'm Shruti Rajagopalan, and in this conversation series, I will be talking trade with Professor Arvind Panagariya, who is the director of the Deepak and Neera Raj Center on Indian Economic Policies and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. In the past, he has served as the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog in Government of India and as chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. He's the author of a number of books, but for today's conversation in particular, we will focus on his recent book, Free Trade and Prosperity. Welcome, Arvind.
Hi, Shruti. Very pleased to be back with you.
Thank you for joining us and talking trade and reforms. I wanted to talk today about a few aspects of protectionism as a continuation of our conversation last time. So in the last episode, you detailed some of the common arguments against free trade and for protectionism, especially in developing countries. Now, I want to come to one of the most, to me, it's one of the most annoying arguments in favor of protectionism and against free trade. And I am yet to see the economic logic of it, even though I've thought about it for a long time. There seems to be this implicit bias against imports, and there is a bias towards exports, right? So everyone wants that we should import nothing and we should keep exporting, right? That's the idea. And this is driven by some kind of like basic misunderstanding of trade deficits. This idea that trade deficits are this terrible thing in any economy. It's going to tank the economy. We need to keep trade deficits low and always be in surplus. So that's one part of the argument. And this keeps coming back. I mean, a very large part of this Make in India movement which is going on right now. I mean, with 30 years post-liberalization, and this argument's come back with a vengeance. So this just doesn't go away. I don't understand the economic logic that supports it or the fascination with it. So what exactly is this argument, and what is the merit, if any? Why isn't this case closed once and for all?
Yeah. No. This absolutely right. That there's. So when you say what is the argument, there is no argument. So the answer is difficult to give. But one can try to explain, why there is not an argument. But we can also come back to why. I think partly, why it keeps coming is that somehow you think that, when imports come in, they displace my products, that whatever is imported, I would be producing. So then we can also, this is also the sort of same fallacy runs through the import substitution argument as well, to which we can come in at the end. I mean, that's the sort of thing going on here. But to see how fallacious, how wrong that argument is, just think of the two options. One is that the country can import whatever it needs without having to export anything at all, right? Yeah. You can all go on vacation, man, just let somebody else do the production activity. We all have to do leisure.
That would be amazing.
It's fantastic, right? So there's one option. You got the second option, where the country kind of sends out exports and receives nothing in return as imports, right? So you can even think, because you think that exports are good, imports are bad. So you say, all right, I don't want any imports, but I want to export. Well, put your goods on the ship, let them go halfway into the ocean, dump all the goods there, let them come back. Now, on your books, these have been exported. So your exports would look very, very good. But and you didn't want any imports in return anyway. So what does it matter if the goods got dumped into the ocean? You can see how foolish that would be. Yeah. And no country would actually do that. And that's the point. That this whole idea somehow that exports are good and imports are bad is totally cockoid, because in the end, you want to export so that you can import. The whole idea ultimately is to be able to export so that you can import. It's the imports is what you're seeking. And we always say in trade we say that if you get a higher price for your exports, which will mean that for any given amount of exports you get more imports, that's better. That's an improvement in your terms of trade. That's I mean, it's like I work for Colombia, and if Colombia raises my salary, that's a good thing for me. It's not a bad thing. I want more, and then I can spend more. It's the same thing that, if we can get a higher price for our exports, then we will be able to import more for that money, for those dollars that we get in return. So, Milton Friedman, once famously said I don't think he wrote it out, but somewhere in speech, that this video exists somewhere, and I remember watching it. He said that, look, exports 1 cent are gone. We can't eat, but imports we can eat. So he said we can't eat exports because they're gone, but we can eat imports. So, once gone, they can neither be consumed nor used to produce any other products. But imports allow you to produce other products, or can be directly consumed. So that's that part, somehow this notion of exports are good and imports are not, it's totally wrong. I mean,
is this because we used to have terrible capital controls? So the foreign exchange problem was really bad, which means the only way you could import anything was if you earned foreign exchange. So they tried to reduce the number of people who were spending foreign exchange and therefore encouraging people who were earning foreign exchange. In the Indian context, that seems to be the only sort of recent logic I can trace. It's very illogical. It's a bad autarkic system of a closed economy. But that's the only place I can even understand why someone would suggest something like this. On every other margin, I simply don't get it. But I have a few more specific questions here. So the first is, you gave this wonderful example of yourself, right? You are you are in a perpetual trade surplus with Colombia, right? You sell them your services, you buy very few services from Colombia. Right. And you're in a perpetual trade deficit, with West Side Market or Fairway, which is the grocery store in your neighborhood, right? And because you are constantly buying things from there every single day. Now, this is not a problem for you at all. In fact, the larger your trade deficits with restaurants and grocery stores, in a way, the happier you are because you're able to buy more. Why does this seem so logical at the individual level, but completely loses the plot at the country level? Why are we talking about trade surpluses and deficits at the nationwide level? That part of the argument I don't understand.
Right. So now you are actually talking not about the aggregate trade deficit or surplus, but you're talking about the bilateral ones.
Bilateral ones,
So you switched to the bilateral ones, before I come to that, something you said earlier, just want to comment about, how this, in the Indian context, love for exports and hate for imports arose. Right? But if you dig a little deeper, it is precisely because you're wanting to import that you want to export. I mean, they were encouraging more and more exports because it was inability to import, right? So somehow, anybody translating that to exports are good, imports are bad. I mean, you're right. Actually, in literal sense, you're absolutely right. That's how it is sort of drilled into the citizenry.
Yeah.
But it is really actually the deep down it's being drilled down because of the fact that you really desperately want to be able to import because even your normal production capacity doesn't get fully used. Because you're not able to import certain raw materials, inputs, components, etc. And so there was always excess capacity in production in India during the 70s and 80s. because of the trade constraint. It was not because imports were bad. Imports were incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
Right. So now come to the
bilateral versus aggregate. You are not in an aggregate trade deficit, right? But you are in bilateral trade deficits quite frequently, depending on who your trading partner is.
Right.
We don't seem to translate this individual logic that I just explained in your specific case. We translate it in a very bizarre way at the countrywide level, right? We want to reduce our imports from China, seems to be the latest clarion call. So can you just walk us through what is going on here? And why is this a terrible argument? It's so harmful to have this bias against imports, because imports, buying components, buying cheap technology, having access to, global production technology is what enables us to be happier consumers, but also better, more efficient producers, because it'll be an input in our output. So actually, import bias I find very harmful for the economy overall. So can you just put this in context for us? Because I just don't understand this.
Yeah. I think things are getting mixed up here. You see, what happens is that a specific case of India-China, even perhaps what I'm going to say applies to the US-China, because US-China has the same deficit problem with China. First, actually, track back a little bit before I come to this argument. First of all, at the aggregate level, you do care about the deficit, because that's largely what defines your current account deficit.
Yeah.
And you don't want overly large current account deficit, because that would mean that you're accumulating foreign debt at a very fast pace, which can, if not, if your foreign exchange reserves are not good, if your exports are not vibrant, somewhere can create a crisis. There's a kind of 1991 balance of payments crisis we have had. But nowadays, after the 91 crisis, this Reserve Bank of India has been very cautious, and we have accumulated vast amount of reserves and all. Yeah. And it runs the current account quite conservatively. Anytime it goes beyond 2%, current account deficit goes beyond 2%, the RBI really kind of begins to worry about the exchange rate and all. So aggregate is fine, right? So therefore, the issue is only the bilateral one.
Yeah.
First of all, why this is happening? Certainly, one part of this, the analogy of my personal life, of surplus with Columbia University and deficit with everybody else is clearly applicable to the countries as well, first of all.
Okay.
Which is, and because, the whole idea of trade is that you buy your goods from the country that sells you the cheapest.
Yeah.
And you sell your goods to the countries that give you the highest price for your goods.
Yeah.
That's how you do it. And it is going to be a hell of a coincidence that the country that sells you the cheapest also gives you the highest price for your goods. It's the same.
Yeah.
Generally, they will be different.
Yeah.
Therefore, you would run surplus with somebody and you'll run deficit with somebody.
Yeah.
And the central bank, RBI, will ensure that on aggregate, your deficit is contained to a couple of percentage points of the GDP. There is an optical illusion here, obviously, that you are complaining about the bilateral deficit with China, but you're not complaining about you're not seeing the fact that you got a bilateral surplus with the United States.
Yeah.
If you actually actively try to reduce your trade with China, your surplus with the United States will also fall. At the end of the day, RBI is going to worry about that, keep it to 1 to 2% of the GDP. So that's not going to, aggregate deficit is not going to change. You reduce imports, your exports will ultimately somewhere get impacted.
Yeah.
But that we don't see. Now, I think part of the political issue here is that there is a lot of protectionism is embedded in this. That you see, if the United States is having too many imports from China, India is having too many imports from China, those who are producing import competing goods, they see that this is an opportunity to, seek some protection against it. So that if these large countries are importing so much from China without exporting them, something is wrong in China. So it's the vested interest in the import competing sectors which would make the greatest noise, that China is dumping, that they are dumping these products on us. They would not, and then nobody, this existence of subsidies, etc., is very hard to verify. And China, in any case, is also, after all, it's a communist country. So you make these allegations, they are subsidizing their exports and all, and this is how they are competitive, and etc., etc. But of course, if the subsidy was the really reason, then you could have challenged them in the WTO. Those, any kind of output or export subsidies that impact trade are challengeable in the WTO. But we are not doing that.
No, but even more basically, if the Chinese government is subsidizing my T-shirts sitting in India, I am not too upset about that.
No, that's a separate point. But that's not the producer. That's not what the producer.
No, that's not a producer concern. That's fair. The producers couched it as dumping what is in fact very well and competitively priced goods.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that China is exporting that to the United States and to India because they are much more competitive in these products. I mean, that's the point. But when there is this very large volume of imports coming from one country into India and into the United States also, then you say, there is something wrong in the Chinese economy, that they are doing something, which is unlawful. And so that becomes then you start focusing. Now, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story, of course, is that any country seeking concession with a country, trade concessions with a country that is exporting a lot to it, is in a good position. I think it gives you a handle. It gives you a handle that, hey, I'm importing so much from you, but I'm not being able to export. Something is wrong in your system. Fix it. I mean, that's what the United States says. They even start fixing the actual quantitative targets that, this is like the voluntary export, voluntary sort of incentives to import more from the United States.
Yeah. Right? No, and also other aspects which are not trade related, like intellectual property and things like that. You also have better position to negotiate other things you may want,
right?
Human rights, or better safety codes and treatment of workers, or intellectual property when you're a very large importer from one single country.
Right. So what do you mean? So to some degree, this bilateral deficit gives you a handle.
Yeah,
that part is okay. So if India wants to use its leverage of this large trade deficit with China to get some concessions out of China, that's okay. I think, the countries do that. That's a more strategic move and taking advantage of it. But as far as economics of it is concerned, beyond the strategic advantage you want to exercise, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with the bilateral deficits with one set of countries and bilateral surpluses with another set of countries.
No, but Arvind, why is the unit of analysis always the producer and not the consumer? Right? This is a very big problem I have when we talk about this bias against imports. So the bias against imports is really only talking about 2 out of 3 parties, right? One party that it's talking about is the producer. The second party it's talking about is the exchequer, because they want, larger revenues that come in if there are higher tariffs, right? There are very few producers usually in any economy, the very large number of consumers. And this import bias enormously disadvantages consumers, right? So if you have 20% tariffs on cheap Android Chinese phones, it's going to really impact Indian consumers, and it's going to impact the poorest consumers the most. And this just seems to be missing from the overall discussion, right? Usually the arguments that economists like you and I give is, yeah, it's going to disadvantage this group of producers, but cheaper inputs means that other producers have cheaper components and cheaper inputs and they can be more productive. But what about the consumer?
Yeah,
That's all of us.
Trade economists always actually take the side of consumers. I would contest that that's what we do. In fact, trade economists are the only players in the game who appoint themselves actually to speak for the consumer.
I don't just mean trade economy. I meant, sorry, I should clarify. I meant the people who are peddling this import
but that
bias.
I mean, that goes back to the political economy of it, that producers are better organized, consumers are almost unorganized completely. So therefore the consumer interests are not represented. Otherwise, I think I probably said this before. Henry George wrote it the best. He said that, look, we are calling this protection, but who are we protecting here? The buyer wants to buy it, the seller wants to sell, and then the government steps in, says, I'm not going to let you buy. Who is being protected here? The seller is not being protected. The buyer is not being protected. How is this protection? But this is the age-old problem, that the fact that in the political process, producers are always much more dominant players than the consumers are. So which is why, as I said, the trade economists are the self-appointed representatives of the consumers, and they are the ones who go and play for. Now a very good example on the Indian context, which also somewhere I may have said before, but is the mobile revolution that took place in India during the 2000s. If India had a high degree of protection, that mobile revolution, which within a span of 8 or 10 years produced 1 billion mobile phones in the hands of the Indian citizens, would have never happened. So in that case, it's very visible, very visible. And certainly, the protectionism we are doing right now against the smartphone, for example, that would impact the access to the smartphones. So many people who would buy low-end smartphones would stay for a while with the feature phones.
But even more basically, the import bias being more about the producer than anyone else. A few years ago, I was in Mumbai during the Ganpati festival, right? And, there is a demand shock for Ganpati idols during that time, because every home will get one, and then they will, of course, dissolve it, in the sea. And that's the ritual. Everywhere you go in Mumbai, shops will have these Ganpati idols. And that year, I asked them who is making these, and they said, ma'am, they're all imported from China, right? The Chinese entrepreneur is aware of this highly local cultural festival, is able to make these idols that can actually satisfy human taste, is able to do it better and cheaper. And most Mumbai families at this point apparently have access to a Ganpati that is produced in China, right? To me, this doesn't seem, there was some outrage over it while I was there. But to me, this doesn't seem like it's hurting anybody, right? Like in general, one would assume that the more families who could afford a Ganpati idol simply to dissolve in the sea a few weeks later, the better. If it's too expensive, fewer families might be able to engage in it. So this is the sort of, thing that I always think about as an example where if the exporting country from which India is importing can actually make something so culturally specific better and cheaper, then perhaps we should let them do it.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that nobody is hurting, right? Because the producers who could produce otherwise those idols are the ones who are hurting, right? I mean, so it's again goes back to the producer interests. Consumer interests are better served, obviously, by the imports. I mean, it's not limited to the Ganpati statues. There are rakhis, there are
Everything.
kites, patang, there all this, which are all cultural products. But but we have to sit back, rather than slap these anti-dumping duties, etc., on the imports from China. We need to sit back and say, what are we doing wrong that this is happening? Why are our producers not able to compete?
Yeah.
I mean, where is the bottleneck?
What are the relevant constraints that we can't produce at scale and produce so cheap?
The moment you say, okay, I'll provide protection, then basically you have said, okay, you have a handicap, but live with the handicap. I will just smooth out the highway for you by simply not letting anybody else enter on the roads.
Now, related to bias against imports, but a separate argument in itself is import substitution, right? This is the big one when it comes to trade protectionism for developing countries. And import substitution policies were, absolutely the mainstream prescription, especially post-World War II, for developing countries. So, free trade is a luxury that only developed economies can engage in and afford. And developing countries must have import substitution policies. And this was sort of the idea. Now, what is the reason that this became the orthodoxy post-World War II? And now you're seeing import substitution arguments return, right? Anytime there's a crisis like the global financial crisis or now the COVID pandemic crisis, import substitution just comes back in a big way in all the arguments, in policy circles, in newspapers, and so on. So can you tell us a little bit about the original argument as a prescription for developing countries in the 50s and 60s? And is there any merit in returning to import substitution policies as India is attempting to do now?
Okay, so yeah, you're absolutely right. This is a very omnipresent kind of issue, historically or contemporarily, wherever you look, this in one form or the other, it keeps coming back. Now, of course, the older argument was, as I mentioned earlier, resulted from this export pessimism. Yeah. That the primary products is what these countries will export, and but that argument is now out of the window because the Koreans and Taiwanese showed us that you can export manufacturing products, the labor-intensive manufacturing products from the beginning. You don't have to, and there is no elasticity pessimism issue associated with that. So that was primarily academically, at least. India's context was very different, which we'll come to in some future episode, right? So I'll not touch on Indian context, which is actually quite dramatically different.
Yeah.
Now, the arguments that I mean, why this has such an appeal. One is, of course, that when you're importing something, demand is certain, that it's there. When, for example, even today, when smartphones are being imported or feature phones are being imported, that there is domestic demand for it. And so there is no uncertainty, anything, exports, you don't know who is going to buy this, that, but here that you got your buyers here. And so that makes import substitution attractive. Why are we importing? We can produce it at home. So it also coincides nicely with the nationalistic kind of, that why are we, I mean, the examples you mentioned, Ganesha statues or things like Rakhis, etc., even more kind of in that direction that, these are our cultural goods, why should we? So there is that demand certainty, which is very important. Also, I think, ministries like to demonstrate success.
Yeah.
And what is the easiest thing to do to demonstrate success? Well, if demand is there, just keep out the imports. You can easily demonstrate success. I mean, even in the Indian context, I remember, I'm sure you also must have noticed that our previous minister for IT, Ravi Shankar Prasad, loved to go out and say that, look, I have created these new 200 or some very large number of manufacturers of mobile phones, right? So that was he would sell it as a huge success, But I've never heard anybody, bragging about export success that they have produced in the Indian context. I can't think of anyone where you would say, export successes are not claimed by the policy guys. You see, the export successes are, our IT, software, very early success that happened, right? That was not a success. Even the government said that we actually created that success. I'm sure government played some role somewhere, but largely we always see that as success of the entrepreneurs, etc. But import successes we all claim. Auto industry we make a claim, because we provided the protection. So for ministries it's a great thing, right? Also, it finds traction politically because the damage that import substitution does, and this is old point made by Frederick Bastiat. Where he said that the good that protection does is apparent to the naked eye, but the harm it does is spread throughout the economy and it can be seen only by an expert eye.
Yeah.
And so, this reduced exports, which inevitably happens Absolutely. When you reduce imports, is too indirect for others to detect. So you only see the benefit side of it, you don't see the cost side of it. And in fact, the cost side is higher than the benefit side, and therefore cost-benefit analysis is against import substitution. But you just don't see the cost side. And so that also makes the import substitution more attractive. And among the politicians is also this belief that they can simultaneously reduce imports and expand exports. Is also then this also gets ties into imports are bad and exports are good, etc., etc. But we all know, if you look at the data, that there's no country that has reduced imports and did not reduce exports. In some particular year it may happen, but if you look at the long-term trends, export and import series move together. Take any time period, any country, this is a kind of practically ironclad rule.
And the flip is also true. The more you export, the more you must import.
I sometimes say that if you compare India and China, for example, in the 2000s and later, India's export response was much weaker than the export response that was happening in China. I often said this, that look, part of India's problem is that the import response has been very muted. That when we opened to trade, right, we went from complete prohibition on trade, almost,
effectively,
effectively, right, prohibitive barriers to relatively open, right, by 2007-8, the top tariff rate had come down to 10% with some exceptions. And yet imports didn't expand as much. And if had the imports expanded, simultaneously exports would have expanded as well. So I often attribute actually the muted export performance to muted import response. But these are the factors, which explain why the import substitution remains an attractive thing. And even, people who otherwise believe in trade often, fall for it. They fall for it, now, historically, if you look at it, what is currently happening in India is to some degree similar to what happened in the 1970s in South Korea. Right? The economy grew, imports grew. Because exports grew, imports grew. And by 1973, imports had become large enough that the policymakers said that, we can produce these things at home. Why are we importing? And with us, similar thing has happened now, that, imports did grow, right? At peak, imports had become about almost 30% of the GDP compared with 10% in 91. And so policymakers think that, oh, this is a large amount. Why am I importing? I can produce them at home.
Yeah.
And they also think that this is a net addition to GDP, whatever I do, because they don't see the negative effect that simultaneously happens on exports. And that is the problem. So they just think that by adding this, I am actually adding to the GDP. There is no subtraction happening. It's only addition that is happening. And it's that kind of...
And they confuse the political entity with an economic entity, right? The economic process is global, it's deeply intricate, right? It's highly decentralized. Who's producing what, how they are competing on price, how there's a new producer, an entrepreneur in a new country who might suddenly provide you something cheaper, but the national entities remain the same. Yeah. So the way the policymakers think about it is us versus them in a country sense, without thinking about producers and consumers as just, individual firms or individual entrepreneurs who might be doing a very intricate global social cooperation in some sense.
Right. But now there is another sort of fallacy that goes, which enhances this import substitution. And that is not understanding the massive protection of import substitution often ends up providing. And so let's take this example. This goes back to our old idea of the effective rate of protection as opposed to the nominal rate of protection.
Yeah.
And so I want to take a little example and explain exactly how this kind of this protection gets so understated actually when you look at the tariff rates, right? So think of the mobile smartphone, some smartphone, let's for simplicity think of this, that it costs $100 to import it, right? And the smartphone is made of about large number of components, which account for about $90 part of its cost. So you can, if you import so under free trade, let's say, if you import smartphone, you can get it for $100, and components themselves, if you were to import only components, they will cost $90. So then any local manufacturer who can assemble the components for $10 or less can effectively compete with the imported smartphones, right? So there is this margin of about $10 for assembly per smartphone that is available to those, and anybody who can carry out that activity can compete.
Yeah.
Now, suppose the government says that, well, there are all these massive large number of smartphones being imported. Why can't we manufacture them at home? So let's give some modest protection to the domestic producers and say we'll impose a 10% custom duty on the imports of smartphones. Right? So it may look like, okay, 20% is not such a big deal, and all. But just think what happens. Now, the price of the imported smartphone has gone up to $120.
Yeah.
Components can still be imported at $90.
Yeah.
So the margin between the 120 and 90 has now gone up to $30.
Yeah.
So now, previously under free trade, you had to be so efficient as to assemble the smartphone in just $10 per unit of cost.
Yeah.
Now you can do up to $30.
Yeah.
Right. So the protection is not 20%. Protection on assembly activity is 200%. It's a 200% protection.
Yeah.
And so you are encouraging massive inefficiency here. That anybody, so no, it's no surprise that when you do this kind of tariff, very large number of manufacturers come in.
Yeah.
Anybody, look, even you and I could sit down and assemble a smartphone for that kind of margin, right? You got a 200% advantage over the best competitor. So, and so you are not going to get these super efficient and super productive assembly manufacturers. You're going to end up with actually all these inefficient guys, who think that as long as the protection remains, we can survive.
Yeah.
And so this is the damage, right? And now that's the one problem, right? But it compounds because so the mobile industry becomes vibrant, it comes in and all. And then the politician and the government bureaucrats, all of them have to look, we created a mobile industry that hardly existed. We have done it. And so now we have to increase this success. So now, which means let's have more value added. So let's, extend protection to maybe half of these components.
Yeah.
Right. So you say, well, I'm just taking an example. So you take half of the components, you say, slap a 20% duty on these components. Now the 10% duty on those components ends up adding about $4.50 to the cost.
Yeah.
So what was importable for $90 now becomes $94.50. Well, I've cut it's 20% duty, right? So it's $9.
Yeah.
It's $9 of duty. So from 90 you go to $99.
Yeah.
Well, 99 and 120, the gap is now reduced to $21.
Yeah.
Now, what will happen to all those assembly fly-by-night assembly manufacturers whose cost was between $21 to $30 per mobile phone? They are all gone.
Yeah.
Either that, or you increase the protection to the final mobile.
Usually
imports.
the latter, because they lobby for it.
Well, once you are becoming a manufacturer, you become more, or you'll create unemployment, right? I mean that if you don't do that, then you'll create unemployment. So the government is also sympathetic. Okay, 20% will go to 30%. So this cascading happens.
Yeah.
And then more components are protected, more protection at the top level, at the final stage. Yeah. So either it's cascading or so you're really adding all these costs. Now, this obsession also with value added per unit is so misplaced, right? So misplaced because now if you do this kind of protectionism and increase the value added, you think that finally assembled smartphone will be competitive?
Yeah.
I mean, even here, you will have to raise that tariff rate just to offset the impact of this 20% duty on half of the component imports by 9 percentage points. So 20% will have to go to 29%. So the mobile phone, your domestic guy is producing mobile phone at $129. And then if the other components are also done, then you have to rate it, put another 9%, and so it goes to 38%, and so $138. Who is going to buy in the global marketplace, what is available for $100 for $138? You'll never capture the global marketplace. You're never going to do that. So this obsession with high value added per unit is so misplaced because anybody can manufacture, entire 100% value added product of anything. You can produce an aeroplane, 100% domestic value added. But it's only the captive buyers at home who can buy it. You'll never capture the global marketplace.
You've just described the Indian auto industry, start to finish.
It is exactly, so they can't. So this is why the 1%, they hardly have even 1% share in the global marketplace. My favorite example here is, particularly with respect to this obsession with value added per unit. I mean, look at China. Now, iPhone. Supposedly 1,600 different parts to it. Current supply chains are spread over about 200 different firms, which are spread over 43 different countries.
Yeah.
And now China has total value added in its iPhone of about 10%.
Yeah.
But it's 100 million plus iPhones.
Yeah.
That's a lot of total value added.
Yeah.
Now, if you can produce the 100% mobile phone, smartphone in India, all parts, components, everything homemade, but how many buyers are you going to get? Not many. So your total value added is constrained by your total market, domestic market, which is also domestic market at that very high price.
Yeah.
Even domestic price at $138 for $100 smartphone will shrink.
Yeah.
And you'll never get the global marketplace. So, what did you achieve? Total value added. Along total value added, you lost out whatever you gained on per unit value added.
Yeah.
Now, this problem actually is now become much more serious than it was perhaps, in the 60s and 70s, because the transportation costs were high.
Yeah.
Right. So you had a comparative advantage in, let's say, clothing. And so, you could have the entire, including fabric or including fiber, etc. Maybe you could produce, because, crisscrossing, that importing fiber or importing fabric, etc. will add to your cost because transportation costs are so high.
Yeah.
But today, transportation costs have really plummeted.
Yeah.
And then production processes have become more complex also.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it has also become much easier to break up the production process into many more. This breakup existed before, and you gave the Adam Smith example of the, making a needle, etc. So this specialization along different parts of the existed before, but today it's much more.
Yeah.
And so this breakability of the production process put together with the very low transport costs has meant that the suppliers have got much more spread out. Each activity is undertaken by the one who can do it the best, and that one takes most of the global market.
Yeah.
So you don't work on value added per unit, but you act on total value added.
Yeah.
Even if it's in very small number of components. That is what you need to do. So if today India's comparative advantage largely lies in labor intensive activities, then capture all the assembly activities, for example.
Yeah.
Or capture some very labor intensive things that can be maybe services, whatever it is.
Yeah, shoelaces.
Right?
Shoelaces is labor intensive.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And spread it and take over the entire global marketplace.
Yeah.
Rather than doing everything more value added.
Yeah.
Now, whether it's true, I've not verified, but like our PLI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme, somebody was telling me, so I have to check this. But if it is true, then it is really fatal, because they're saying that you get this incentive if you produce 80% of the value added domestically. That's a surefire recipe that anybody who takes advantage of that subsidy is not going to be competitive in the global marketplace.
Yeah.
It's a double whammy,
It is a double whammy
for the country, because also the subsidies in many cases is being provided for highly capital intensive industries. So if you do find some takers, what you're doing is you're massively kind of moving capital, which is a very scarce factor,
relative to labor,
into these highly capital intensive sectors, will create no jobs.
No, actually, there is more. I think it's triple whammy, right? So you're providing these subsidies at the cost to the taxpayer. So that's
right.
one problem.
That's true, yeah.
The second is the Indian consumer pays far more for a car or something that has similar protection than they would pay if they imported that car or compared to the global consumer. And the third is the Indian manufacturer has been completely coddled into becoming not competitive and is not able to export in the global market, right? So it's multiple whammies. It's not just double whammy.
And the scarce capital being
right, being utilized. So there's so many distortions that are being created. This is actually an incredibly helpful exposition on the import substitution.
So this is where, there is something in India called Phased Manufacturing Program,
Yeah.
PMP.
Yes.
It is a favorite of our bureaucrats,
Yes.
and this created massive problems. I gave you earlier that tube light example. That was exactly the phased manufacturing program that will give you license to produce, provided after 4 years, you also source the components that go into tube light from home, from domestic suppliers. So this is the PMP, and it didn't succeed at all. Actually, and what happened was that the quality of those domestic tube lights only went down because the local guys, whatever quality parts they manufactured, the fellows had to buy, and so therefore the quality of the tube lights that were manufactured was very poor also. So there are multiple failures of that program that happened, but that has been now resurrected.
Yeah.
You can hear Piyush Goyal talking about phase manufacturing program. You could previously, I remember the Hasmukh Adhia, who was the revenue secretary, was talking about this phase manufacturing program, as if 20 years, 30 years passed and we are completely over asleep and suddenly woke up and say, oh, we have to do phase manufacturing program again. It's tragic. I mean, if at one level, if one thinks.
No, and it keeps coming back. This is actually I can't even imagine how frustrated you are having worked on trade your entire career. But for me, each time I read these arguments in popular press or, when ministers are talking about it, I just feel so frustrated and annoyed. Because it feels like this is settled. We understand this as economists, but we haven't managed to communicate this, more generally. And of course, there are all these political economy issues of consumers not being able to collectivize and organize, and producers being able to do that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, on frustration, let me say no frustration here, because there's so few of us who are making that case, and yet we have succeeded ultimately. So it's not so bad. We did actually score pretty good success.
It also means our jobs are not going to be obsolete or substituted anytime in the near future.
That's true. For sure. That if protectionism doesn't go away, then trade economists will not have to go away either. That's true. But I think one needs to see some successes happening, and I think we have scored quite a bit of success actually. These reversals do happen, will happen, and all, but.
And sometimes, you get a big win, which cuts through the seen and the unseen problem, like the Big Bang liberalization that happened in 1991. Yeah. You can really see, everybody can see the benefits of that kind of opening up. Right. So there are these nice wins that sometimes become very seen and can, help propel other arguments.
Right, but not just 91, right
continue.
Now also, right now, the very similar, mutually reinforcing. I say the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the GST, third, your labor law reforms, and fourth, your corporate profit tax knocked down to 17% for new manufacturers and to 25% for the rest. These are very mutually reinforcing reforms. It could be really, the benefit could be multiplied yet more if we also worked on trade side, because
and also streamline those reforms, right? GST can be streamlined.
No, but that's
happening.
Look, that's happening. That's happening. A lot of IBC also needs to be some streamlining and all. But that's a constant. This is a big thing has happened. There will be bumps on the road. You have to clean those up. I mean, GST bumps, for example, have been cleaned up, which is why you're seeing this massive expansion in tax revenues. Yeah. The GST platform was working very poorly earlier, but that has been sorted out, and now people like the public finance experts Govinda Rao, he says that this GST revenue will go up a lot more.
Yeah, I actually think the revenues will go up the more we simplify the GST structure. This rate proliferation that has taken place for various political economy reasons, I think that needs to really come back down. I
No,
recently
that will
wrote a
also
paper.
happen. There is
Yeah.
also outstanding issue of bringing the petroleum products into the GST as well,
Yes.
and also. But look, I mean, India is a very difficult country, and today, of course, we have seen that Prime Minister Modi had to finally back down on the farm law reforms. He's agreed to repeal them.
Yeah, so the reforms don't have a linear path. They
So
go
it's not
in
linear.
fits
So
and
bumps, yeah.
starts. So I want to move on next to this idea of coordination externalities, right? This is one more externality argument in favor of protectionism. If I understand it correctly, this is basically Rosenstein and Rodin's work. This is mostly in Eastern Europe, but it argues that the government needs to engineer production of many items simultaneously rather than focusing on a single item. And here there's a question of externalities that can propel processes, not just the goods, right? So this is the rough model. Of course, this is in the context of erstwhile Soviet Union and then transition economies, some of these models. What is this coordination externality argument, and does it have any merit for having any kind of trade protectionism?
So, Shruti, this is one argument where there is absolutely no validity to it for protection. Okay. There may be validity conceptually for some kind of intervention, but for protection, it has zero validity. And it's very simple. I'll tell you. Take a very, very simple example. Right? It's a very simple example that you need to brush your teeth. You need brush and you need toothpaste. Now, suppose I can make a toothbrush, but it will sell only if you produce toothpaste. If you don't produce toothpaste, then my brush is no good. But of course, if you produce toothpaste and I don't produce toothbrush, then your production is of toothpaste is no good. It's not going to get anything. So there is a coordination failure problem. And if the government steps in and incentivizes each of us to produce it, promises that if you incur any losses, I will recover. I will cover all your losses. Then each of us produces, and there are no losses that are happening, and the government really actually doesn't have to spend any money on covering either your losses or mine, and the problem is solved, right? But now think about the possibility of international trade. If toothpaste can be imported, I don't need any coordination. I can go ahead, happily produce toothbrush, and toothpaste will be imported, and problem is solved. So, in fact, protection will precisely be the wrong thing to do in this case, because it is going to hamper. It will, in fact, what can be coordinated internationally will fall out of coordination. So that argument was actually, when originally Rosenstein Rodin made, it was entirely in the context of a closed economy.
Yeah.
And to apply it in an open economy is actually completely the wrong argument, So this argument, I mean, Danny Roderick again here is the one leading the charge, and he makes this argument in the context of South Korea and Taiwan and all, that coordination problem is what the Taiwanese and South Korean governments solved in the 60s and 70s. Now, first of all, for that, he has to really assume that there are certain activities that require coordination that were non-traded, that they simply trade was not possible. All right. So certainly then it can't be an argument for protection. Because if you're assuming that the product itself is completely non-traded, which is the only context in which coordination failure can happen, then it's not a trade issue in the first place. So the protection, it may be argument for any kind of other intervention. It cannot be an argument for protection. Coordination, in fact, trade actually is what helps you solve the coordination problem. I mean, if you go back, I'm old enough to remember, when this development literature was coming through, and we had this literature same kind of issue, but in terms of balanced and unbalanced growth.
Yeah.
And balanced growth guys saying that. So they was always worried about the demand side of it and all. Very much Rosenstein-Ronan style that, look, if you do certain activities all together, then there is demand, therefore, for each other, right? If you do a big shoe factory in a closed economy, then you will pay these workers higher wages than what you're paying them in agriculture. But what are these workers going to spend these higher wages on? Because they can buy only a small fraction of the shoes that they are producing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you could make a massive investment and invest simultaneously in shoes, clothing, other consumer products, then they will have demand for each other's products, and therefore you'll clear the market. That was Rosenstein-Ronan's original argument. But obviously it's assuming the existence of very large-scale economies, so that each of these activities has to be done on a certain scale.
Yeah.
Because if there were no scale economies, then there is no reason. I mean, any entrepreneur could come in and produce, because production costs are constant. So you can produce all these different products in one. One entrepreneur could do it and have a diversified basket of production.
Yeah.
And so it will automatically, market will solve the problem. Today, in any case, with very large investors available, the big business houses, even in the Indian context, like the Ambanis and the Tatas, etc., very big business houses. So they can actually solve the coordination problem, right? I mean, in their context, for example, you want to produce an automobile. Now you need the auto parts, and you need all sorts of other ancillary products which contribute to the manufacturing of the automobile. Of course, if trade is possible, then in any case you can import these. But even if trade is not possible, they get a piece of land which is 100 acres, and then they put up everything that they need in one place. So they managed to, today, large investors can solve that problem.
But I have a more fundamental question here. Adam Smith, very early on in The Wealth of Nations, right? He tells us that the division of labor and the degree of specialization is going to be limited by the size of the market, right? So when he starts talking about the division of labor in the pin factory, he's very clear that people are going to dedicate themselves to pulling out the wire in a pin factory 12 hours a day, day after day, and engage in that kind of division of labor and specialization only if they are able to purchase everything else that they need, right? So if they can't, you're not going to get that kind of division of labor. So in the Smithian open economy, free trade model, you will get a lot of diversification if the trade is very limited, right? That is, each person needs to produce multiple things and coordinate. If the trade is relatively frictionless, open, and the size of the market is large, then you can get very high degrees of specialization. So to me, it seems like it's endogenous to the model, right? There isn't an exogenous quantity of optimal specialization in any economy, and therefore coordination, right? The assumption is I'm going to spend all my time making toothpaste only if I'm confident that we can purchase toothbrushes, right? Otherwise, the toothpaste won't be forthcoming in the first place. What am I missing in this kind of Adam Smith, free trade, which endogenizes the degree of division of labor and specialization, vis-a-vis these models that you just talked about, where we're talking about coordination failures which need to be engineered? I just don't understand why. So maybe I'm missing some step or some assumption.
Yeah, no, I think, basic point comes across in what you're saying, right? That, if I'm an open economy, then in fact, I don't need to coordinate. And I, in fact, want to specialize. I don't want to, and particularly if I'm not only open, but I'm also relatively small, right? Yeah. And every developing country, no matter population-wise how large, whether it was India or China in the 1950s, it's a very small economy. I mean, if you look at till 1980 or so, or the GDP in India was smaller than the GDP in South Korea.
Yeah.
And we used to sort of, smugly talk about South Korea as being quite small relative to us. But the fact of the matter is that the GDP of South Korea exceeded our GDP. Today, things have changed, after we opened up and also started growing. So really, if you're a relatively small economy, which, as I said, all developing countries are when they start off, then you don't want to undertake too many activities precisely for the reasons that Adam Smith very clearly laid out, that, you want to take advantage of the specialization process. And import what inputs you don't produce, and that is what really even allows you to begin to industrialize, right? If you're starting with assembly activities, then you can import components and still assemble and get going. So absolutely, so this coordination argument is very strictly, look, I mean, it's not a coincidence that Rosenstein-Ronan was the one who kind of first wrote it out, because he was a Polish economist.
These are closed economies. These are centrally planned economies.
Exactly. So
when now, instead of the market process, you need an engineered process to do everything that the market would have naturally done, endogenizing the solution to most of the problems that they've highlighted.
Right. So this is actually, as far as protectionism is concerned, this is the weakest argument. In fact, it's not even an argument, really. Because
well, I'm happy we still went over it, even though it doesn't have much merit in the literature, because my problem with protectionism is these arguments never seem to go away. Every decade they come back in some random, completely made up context in some industry gathering or some op-ed article. And then everyone is gaga and say, yes, we are normally all for free trade, but for the purpose of diversification or for the purpose of coordination, now we need some kind of intervention.
I mean,
actually, this is a good point to set up our next conversation, which we will start talking about India finally. I think you've been very patient with us in explaining and laying the ground for arguments in favor of free trade and sort of walking us through the merits, mostly demerits of arguments in favor of protectionism. So starting in the next episode, it'll be great if we can now focus on Indian political economy and the history of Indian protectionism, starting in colonial times and then continuing through Indian socialism, and then, of course, the liberalization. So hopefully we can continue this conversation in that direction and also touch upon the more recent reforms that you just mentioned.
We shall do that.
Yes. Thank you so much, as always, Arvind.